Bonnie Baxter Clark, a professor of biology and the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute, with a presentation on climate change in our watershed. Dr. Baxter has spent two decades studying the Great Salt Lake, in particular microbiology. She is co-editing the first book on the lake's biology, which will be published in the spring, and authored a chapter in the book on the Great Salt Lake and climate change. She currently serves on statewide committees which address the fate of the lake and our watershed. Here's Bonnie.
Great to see you all here today. So I do work on Great Salt Lake, and Great Salt Lake is at the bottom of the watershed. So this is an outline of the Pleistocene, the Ice Age Lake Bonneville. And when it dried up after a giant climatic change event, as we went from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, Great Salt Lake was the puddle at the bottom of the bathtub that was remaining. And this is now the current watershed in orange. And you can see the river systems that come into Great Salt Lake. So I'm going to mostly talk about the lake as kind of the canary in the coal mine, because the inputs that change with respect to water, and that is a reflection of climate, are seen directly in this terminal lake. So it is normal for a terminal lake to shrink and swell over time. That has always happened because it is at the bottom of the largest watershed in North America. And so it responds to water input from precipitation, and it responds to evaporation, which is related to temperature. The problem is, this is the 1980s, this was 2010, now we have shrunk further than that. So the problem is we're on a decline that is increasing and not letting up. So it's not its normal cycle anymore. The other thing about Great Salt Lake is that its surface area is exposed for evaporation in ways that other terminal lakes in the West aren't. You see how it's super shallow and flat relative to other lakes, so it can evaporate really readily, and the decline of the lake is in part related to its structure, so it's telling us something. So my students and I study the microbes that are in the lake that turn over the nutrients and feed the invertebrates in the lake and also in the wetlands. And those feed 5 million birds. This is the most important body of water on the Pacific Flyway. So if something happens to this lake, this ecosystem will crush millions of birds, and that's 247 species. The shorelines are declining, and what does that mean for us? Why is that happening? One of the reasons is an increase in the population in the watershed. This represents 83% of the population of Utah, this watershed. So the bigger this population gets, the more consumptive use, the more use for agriculture. So that's definitely one of the reasons for the decline. Also, we have a really bad water ethic in Utah. We have cheap water, which makes people spend no energy thinking about the water that they use. So you'll notice in Arizona, there aren't lawns, but in Salt Lake City, there's a ton of grass lawns, right? Because we water our lawns. So it's a different water ethic here than maybe it should be. But the main reason that we're seeing the decline is related to climatic factors. So this is surfacing as the primary driver of the problems that we're seeing. And this part is only going to get worse. We can do something about this part, and this is likely to get worse. So we really have to pay attention. The Southwest of the United States has some pretty dire predictions based on some really good science about climate change. If the water is declining, what happens to the ecosystem? If the lake gets concentrated, the salts get concentrated, the system gets even more salty. Those invertebrates and those microorganisms die. The birds no longer have anything to eat. The ecosystem collapses. So in terms of just the system, yeah, we ought to care about that. But some people are going to be like, I don't care about birds. Well, okay, so what about humans? The impact of the lower lake level on humans will impact both economic services and ecosystem services. If you want to know how much the lake gives the state of Utah, it's $1.32 billion annually and more than 7,000 jobs. So the lake goes away, the state loses money, we lose jobs. That's one thing to care about. ecosystem services, there was a report done in 2012 by the State Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, and they looked at two main factors and estimated that the ecosystem services from this lake is probably between 46 million and 95 million, but they based that on two main things. One is that we all poop into the lake. Seriously. So our sewage goes into the lake. It's part of our watershed. And our sewage gets cleaned before it goes into the lake. But if our lake had fish in it, it would have to be cleaned extra. And we save money by not having to treat water the way you do when you poop into a basin that is fresh water. So being a little crude here, but that's true. So we save money on sewage treatment. We have to treat our sewage less than other places. The other point that they looked at were recreation on the lake, but things that they didn't look at that also are important. It's hard to calculate like what you get from the environment just from a cultural, spiritual standpoint. And also, they didn't calculate things like the ski industry. We depend on this lake effect, snow, right, for industry in Utah, and also a whole lot of fun. That lake effect snow is another ecosystem service. Dust mitigation is a really big one, and I'm going to get into that in a second. It is critical for so many reasons that we keep this lake full of water to prevent dust from blowing into the valley. What will happen if Great Salt Lake shrinks even more? We're currently sitting at a historic low. That means in the time that we've been measuring the lake elevation, it hasn't been lower than it is right now. We're just several inches above the historic low of 1963, so we're right at that historic low. Real concern that a lot of us have is about dust, because what happened in California is that LA sucked the water out of Owens Lake, and it became a dry valley, and produced dust storms like no one had ever seen before, set air quality records. So now, 20% of everyone's water bill in Los Angeles goes to pay for sprinkling and mitigating the dust of Owens Lake. We don't want our valley to look like that. The other thing down here I have is about albedo, and that has to do with dust blowing onto snow. Snow is usually reflective, but if dust blows onto snow, now it absorbs heat and warmth from the sun, and it melts. And this changing of the mistiming of the snow melt is a problem, because our snowpack slowly recharges groundwater in our watershed. If the melt of the snow, the timing changes, you can run off too quickly, you can evaporate too quickly, and not recharge groundwater. So that could be devastating to our whole watershed and our water supply. I want to end here with a presentation that was given to the state of Utah this week by a consulting group. Jeff Demblaker from Jacobs, this consulting group, is hired by the state to do some modeling about predictions on Great Salt Lake and the elevation. And this might not make a little sense. I'll just take you through. He talked about 4 different scenarios, and he's looking at 10 years from now, so 2030, started modeling for 2020 to 2030. If you look at the change in elevation, if we do nothing right now, if our water usage is the same, we expect the lake to go down 3.3 feet, which is a huge amount of water loss. That's a huge amount of shoreline exposure. If we adopt the state water strategy that's being considered, the lake will go down still almost 2 feet. If we do some innovative, adaptive innovation, their model calls it, if we get really innovative with it, it's possible we could reduce that to a reduction of water of 1.2 feet. If we do nothing and we get the hot population growth that we're anticipating, that the state is always bragging about, because we're growing and we're developing, and if that happens and we do nothing, the lake could go down almost 12 feet, and that would be completely catastrophic. That's a 10-year window we're talking about, so I had to share that with you. It's new data, but I thought it was super interesting. So I'll leave this with the idea that we really need to get active This lake is telling us something about our watershed. It is the canary in the coal mine. It's speaking to us. There are terminal lakes all over the world that are drying up, like Lake Urmia in Iran, the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan, because these terminal lakes are at the bottom of basins that we are using the water before it gets there. I think we should listen to the message that it's sending.